The dawn in the Pacific camp was thick with the smell of rust and wet earth. Barbed wire shimmered under a pale sun, and every gust carried the sour tang of sweat, diesel, and fear. Japanese women, once teachers and nurses, now shuffled barefoot across the mud for the daily ration check. Their breath came out like fog in the humid air, each exhale a small act of survival. Before we go deeper, quick question for you. Which city are you watching from right now, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. You're about to step into one of the most unsettling stories the war left behind. The gate creaked open. A jeep rolled in, its tires splashing puddles the size of helmets. At the wheel sat a man who didn't look like the others' broad hat, rough denim shirt, boots dusted with red dirt. The guards called him Tex, but to the prisoners he was something else entirely, a walking contradiction. His easy grin didn't match the rifle slung across his shoulder. Around 30,000 Japanese civilians were detained in scattered Pacific camps after the war's end. Some were soldiers' widows, others refugees from bombed-out islands. Most had no idea when, or if, they'd ever see home again. Tex leaned against the jeep, lighting a cigarette. The smoke curled through the morning haze as he scanned the women's faces. He didn't shout orders. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. From Emiko's perspective, he looked almost cinematic. A man from those American magazines that once seemed worlds away. But when his gaze met hers, a chill ran up her spine. He smiled like the sun. She would later write, but his eyes said price. The camp commandant barked at the women to line up straighter, but Tex didn't move. He just kept watching Emiko, the corner of his mouth twitching like he'd already decided something. A hush spread through the line. Somewhere beyond the fence, a generator coughed to life, drowning out the crickets. In that static hum, a new kind of fear was born, not from bullets or hunger, but from the quiet attention of one man in a cowboy hat. And the next morning that man would return, with an offer. The next morning the same sound broke the silence before sunrise, the sputter of a jeep engine coughing through the mist. Boots hit the ground, the cowboy was back. Tex, someone whispered, and the word spread through the barracks like static. He wasn't like the other guards. They barked, he smiled. They kept distance. He strolled close enough for you to smell the tobacco on his breath. He had that easy swagger born under open skies, not battlefields. The other soldiers called him the cowboy from Abilene. To the women behind the fence, he was a riddle they didn't want to solve. Tex leaned against a post, hat low, watching the women carry buckets from the well. "You work too hard," he drawled, half-smile hiding something sharper. The translator hesitated, unsure whether to repeat the line. Reports from the Pacific camps later revealed that roughly 12% of American guards came from ranch or farming backgrounds, men used to controlling herds, not handling prisoners. That habit of command showed in Tex's every movement. Even his kindness had a leash attached. He'd toss candy to the children, help fix a broken water pump, joke with the cooks. Then, without warning, he'd single out one face and hold it just a second too long. Emiko felt that look burning through the dust between them. The nights grew restless. Women whispered about him in low voices, half fear, half fascination. "He treats war like a rodeo," one said. Another muttered, "He ropes hearts instead of cattle." The laughter that followed was thin and brittle. Tex began visiting the barracks more often, sometimes carrying supplies, sometimes excuses. He'd tip his hat, ask harmless questions, then linger. Always the same calm tone, always that same heavy silence when he left. By the third day, Emiko stopped meeting his eyes. But Tex noticed anyway. His boots echoed on the wooden walkway as he passed her door, slow and deliberate, like a man counting steps towards something inevitable. Outside, the camp generator buzzed again, the same droning sound that had masked their fear the morning before. Emiko tried to sleep, but the noise fused with a thought she couldn't shake. He doesn't just watch. He waits, and when the waiting ends, he'll speak the words that no prisoner ever expected to hear. That night, the rain came down like needles on canvas. The barracks roof hissed and leaked, and somewhere outside, a jeep door slammed shut. Emiko froze mid-step. The sound was unmistakable. Tex was back, after lights out. A lantern flickered in the hallway, throwing long shadows over the wooden floorboards. The air smelled of kerosene and wet uniforms. Someone whispered her name, but before she could respond, a soft knock came at the door. Emiko, the voice drawled low, deliberate. The translator wasn't there, just Tex. His silhouette filled the doorway, the brim of his hat dripping rain. "I can help you," he said, words thick with meaning. "You help me, I help you. Freedom for love." The phrase hit her like a slap. Freedom for love. He set a ration tin on the table, real meat, a rarity in the camp. "You don't belong here," he murmured. "I could get your name cleared. You'd walk out that gate. Just stay close to me." Outside, thunder rolled across the island. Inside, silence grew heavy enough to crush the air. Records later confirmed that over 400 cases of coerced fraternization were filed in Pacific detention zones after the war. Most never reached trial. For women like Emiko, the line between survival and shame was paper thin. Tex took a slow step closer. The smell of wet leather and tobacco filled the room. Emiko's hand trembled on the ration tin. He made freedom sound like perfume. She would later write, sweet, impossible, and poisoned. Behind him, a guard's flashlight beam cut across the courtyard. Tex turned, jaw tightening, then whispered, "Think about it." He slipped into the rain, leaving muddy bootprints and a silence that hummed louder than thunder. Emiko sat on the cot, staring at the food. For the first time since her capture, she felt not hunger, but humiliation. By dawn, the rumor had already spread. The women avoided her gaze at roll call, their whispers sharper than barbed wire. And yet, when Tex appeared again that morning, hat tilted, cigarette between his lips, his eyes carried no shame, only patience. The storm had passed, but its echo stayed. Tonight, she would face the decision that would define her survival or destroy it. By morning, the rain had dried into steam that rose off the mud like ghosts. Emiko stood near the fence, her hands raw from washing linens, her mind replaying Tex's words, "Freedom for love." The phrase clung to her skin like the damp air. She tried to scrub the thought away, but it stayed. Like a stain too deep for soap. Every clang of a bucket, every shout of an officer, became an echo of his offer. She'd refused him once, but in a place where tomorrow wasn't guaranteed, refusal felt like a luxury. Her thoughts drifted to Tokyo. Before the bombings, before the surrender, she remembered her husband, Hiroshi, walking through the morning markets in a pressed uniform, promising he'd return by winter. That was 3 winters ago. He'd vanished with the empire that sent him. Now, the only man who said her name was wearing a cowboy hat. Reports estimate between 500,000 and 700,000 Japanese civilians died during the occupation years. Disease, hunger, suicide, despair. Emiko knew she was a number waiting to happen. In her diary, she wrote, "I am not afraid of death. I am afraid of forgetting who I am before it comes." She watched Tex from across the yard, laughing with another guard as they tossed rations to a stray dog. The sound was light, human, almost kind, but she couldn't forget the look in his eyes that night, the transaction hidden inside his tenderness. When the siren called the women back inside, she lingered by the fence, the metal still warm from the sun. Maybe he meant his offer differently, she thought. Maybe there was a piece of mercy in him, or maybe that was the lie prisoners told themselves to keep breathing. That night, as the camp lights dimmed and the generator hummed to life again, Emiko found herself walking toward the officers' tents. Each step was heavier than the last. She didn't plan what she'd say. She just knew she couldn't carry the silence anymore. The shadows stretched long behind her as she reached the tent flap. Inside, an oil lamp flickered, and a familiar voice said quietly, "You came." The next few seconds would decide whether she remained a prisoner or something much harder to define. The flap of the canvas tent swung shut behind her, sealing out the world with one heavy breath. Inside, the smell of oil, sweat, and damp canvas clung to everything. The rain had started again, soft at first, then relentless. The steady tat-tat, tat on the roof became the metronome to her heartbeat. Tex stood near a metal cot, hat off this time, his hair plastered by humidity. A single oil lamp cast an amber halo around him, turning his face half light, half shadow. "Didn't think you'd come," he said softly, almost regretful. Emiko didn't answer. She just stared at the tin cup on the table, steam rising from black coffee, an impossible luxury in a prisoner's world. The smell was intoxicating, foreign. "Sit," he said. The word wasn't a command, not exactly, but neither was it a request. Guard misconduct files from the Pacific Theater nearly tripled between 1944 and 1945. Many marked moral violations. Reports buried deep in archives tell of fraternization exchanges, often phrased to sound consensual. But the truth never needed paperwork. Tex stepped closer, his boots pressing softly into the canvas floor. "You don't deserve this life," he murmured. "You could have real food, new clothes, peace." His voice carried a strange tenderness, one that felt rehearsed. "All I ask is a little faith." Emiko met his gaze. "Faith," she repeated, her voice small but steady. "Is that what you call it?" The pause hung between them. Then she said, "You think kindness is something you can trade." He blinked, his jaw tightening. For the first time, the cowboy facade cracked. "You don't understand," he muttered, turning away. "Out here, everyone trades something." Her hands trembled, but she stood taller. "Then I trade nothing." The silence that followed was a wall neither could cross. Tex sighed, set the cup down untouched, and nodded. "You're stronger than I thought." His tone carried no anger, just quiet resignation. Emiko turned and left without another word. The rain hit her face like needles, but she didn't flinch. Behind her, Tex's silhouette, wet, lingered at the tent's entrance, watching her vanish into the dark. By morning, the whispers would multiply, and his patience would harden into obsession. By the next dawn, silence had become the loudest sound in camp. Conversations died the moment Emiko entered a room. Tin cups clinked against metal tables, eyes dropped, whispers crawled through the corners like insects. What happened in that tent was nobody's business, but everybody knew. In the women's barracks, gossip moved faster than hunger. Some said she'd accepted Tex's deal. Others said he'd forced it. None knew the truth, and that made it worse. The thin walls couldn't hold the noise. She met him alone. One voice hissed, "At night." The words had teeth. That morning, Emiko folded uniforms with mechanical precision. The laundry steam rose around her, turning faces into ghosts. She tried to disappear into the rhythm. Dip, ring, fold, but shame is a scent. It follows. Tex walked past outside, his boots crunching the gravel. He didn't look her way. Maybe guilt had finally found him, or maybe he was letting the rumor do his work for him. Archival data later revealed that roughly 3 out of every 10 female detainees in Pacific camps reported unusual guard interactions. I term cold enough to erase the emotion behind it. The truth was simpler. Fear made them silent, and silence kept them safe. That night in the barracks, someone finally spoke up. "You think he'll come for you again?" a woman asked in the dark. Emiko didn't reply. The only sound was the creak of the bunk as she turned away. Freedom began to feel like a trap. She would later write, "Every door looked open, but every path led back to him." Outside, guards laughed near the mess hall, their voices muffled by rain. Somewhere in that laughter, Tex's deep drawl stood out. He was still here, still watching, still waiting for her to break. But the rumors had reached further than he realized. That week, a new officer arrived to inspect the camp. He was strict by the book and allergic to scandal. When whispers about the cowboy and the woman hit his desk, he ordered Tex in for questioning. The camp's air shifted again, this time not with fear, but with the sharp scent of retribution. By sundown, Tex would find himself under the same scrutiny he'd once used as a weapon. The mess hall reeked of burnt coffee and diesel when they called Tex in. 2 officers sat behind a folding desk, papers spread out like a firing line. Outside, rain hammered the tin roof. Inside, the air was still, thick enough to choke on. Tex stepped forward, hat in hand. "You wanted to see me, sir." His drawl had softened, his confidence dented. The senior officer didn't look up. "There've been reports, the word hung in the air like smoke, about your conduct with prisoners." Tex's jaw tightened. "Rumors," he said. "You know how talk spreads in a cage." The officer's eyes finally met his. "Then you won't mind us checking." Across the yard, Emiko could hear the murmur of English voices through the thin walls of the office. She didn't know what they were saying, but every rise and fall of tone felt like thunder in her stomach. During the Pacific occupation years, 17 guards were officially demoted for what reports labeled moral misconduct. Unofficially, many more were quietly reassigned, moved instead of punished. Justice often stopped at paperwork. Tex stood tall, even as questions cut through him like barbed wire. "Did you meet a female detainee after hours? Did you enter the women's quarters? Were there exchanges food, promises, favors?" He didn't flinch. "I did my duty," he said, "fed the hungry, fixed what broke, that's all." But the officer's pen kept scratching. "And the tent meeting," Tex exhaled slowly. "She came to talk. I didn't touch her. Then why the silence after?" Tex's voice cracked just slightly. "Because silence keeps people safe." Outside, the wind pushed rain through the open slats, speckling his uniform. He didn't bother to wipe it away. "They said I broke conduct, not hearts," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for the note taker to glance up. The officer signed the final paper and said, "You'll be reassigned, effective immediately." Tex nodded once. No salute, no protest, just a long look at the muddy yard beyond the door, the same yard where Emiko now stood, folding linens under the gray sky. He walked out, passing her without a word. She turned away, pretending not to notice the scent of tobacco fading behind him. But the story wasn't over. His reassignment didn't mean disappearance, only distance, and distance sometimes makes ghosts more dangerous. The whistle sliced through the humid air like a blade. The day of transfer had come. Rows of Japanese women, their belongings wrapped in rags, were herded toward the rail line that cut through the jungle. Guards shouted names, checked lists, and pushed them into weathered train cars. Emiko clutched her bundle, 2 photos, a torn scarf, and a diary bound with string. The air inside the carriage was stale with iron and sweat. Through the slats, sunlight flickered over her face like Morse code. When the engine coughed to life, she looked up and froze. On the platform stood Tex, his hat low, duffel over his shoulder. He was reassigned, but not far. The rumor was true. He'd been ordered to escort the prisoner transport. Her stomach dropped. Fate, it seemed, wasn't done playing games. Historical logs note that over 2,000 Japanese women were moved to repatriation centers across the Pacific in 1946, many crammed into cargo trains built for supplies, not souls. The journey was meant to be safe, but nothing about confinement felt safe. Tex climbed aboard the lead car, his silhouette framed by sunlight and smoke. He didn't glance her way, he didn't need to. His presence alone filled the air with tension, unspoken, magnetic, poisonous. The wheels groaned, the train lurched forward, metal screeched against metal, drowning the low sobs inside. Emiko pressed her palm against the wooden wall, feeling every vibration like a heartbeat. Hours passed. The jungle blurred into endless green. The women sat shoulder to shoulder, too tired to cry, too proud to sleep. A child whimpered, soothed by her mother's lullaby, by one that sounded like home and loss at once. At a brief stop, Tex stepped off for inspection. Emiko saw him through the crack, leaning on the railing, cigarette burning low. For a second, she thought he looked smaller, like the uniform had outgrown him. Then his head turned. Even through the distance, she felt the weight of his gaze. Even in chains, his hat found me, she wrote later. The whistle shrieked again. The train jerked forward into deeper jungle, toward another camp, another promise of freedom. But halfway there, the convoy would stop, for reasons no one expected. The train rattled through the jungle like a wounded animal. Every screech of metal sounded like a scream trapped inside the iron walls. Emiko sat near a splintered window, her fingers tracing the condensation on the glass, watching the blur of green and smoke pass by. Inside the carriage, the air was thick, stale breath, rust, and fear blending into one choking perfume. The women barely spoke. Their silence wasn't peace, it was survival. One whisper could travel, and every rumor carried punishment. Reports describe these transport cars as holding between 120 and 200 prisoners each. Little light, no ventilation, just hope measured in heartbeats and motion. Emiko's knees ached from the rough floorboards. She clutched her diary close, its pages damp from humidity. The words inside were the only place she still existed freely. Through the narrow slit in the boards, she saw flashes of Tex outside, sometimes walking the length of the train, sometimes staring into the trees. His face was unreadable now, no trace of the easy grin that had once unsettled her. Night fell without warning. The jungle turned into a black sea. Somewhere up front, the engine hissed, slowing down. The sudden quiet made everyone look up. The wheels ground to a halt. The silence was sharp enough to hurt. A shout came from the front American voices. Then the heavy boots of inspectors moving along the train, their flashlights slicing through gaps in the wood. Emiko's heart pounded. She didn't know if this was salvation or something worse. She could hear them counting heads, checking names, barking orders. Every stop sounded like a promise broken. Someone whispered, "Maybe they'll move us again." Another said, "Or maybe this is the end." No one dared to answer. Tex's shadow appeared at the door, framed by the glow of lanterns. For a moment their eyes met again, through wood, through fear, through everything that couldn't be said aloud. He looked older now, or maybe just tired of pretending. The train jerked once more, but slower this time. The inspection team had arrived. Emiko didn't know it yet, but what happened in the next few minutes would change both their fates. Because the next man who stepped onto that train wasn't there for transport. He was there for judgment. The lantern light cut through the slats like blades as the inspection team boarded the train. Boots thudded on metal. Paper shuffled. The sound of authority was unmistakable, sharp, clean, practiced. Emiko held her breath as a flashlight beam swept across faces. Dust motes danced in the light like tiny ghosts. Name, an officer barked, the translator echoing in Japanese. One by one, voices answered, trembling but clear. Then the beam landed on her. You, he said, stand. Her knees protested, but she rose. The officer glanced down at the clipboard, then at Tex, who stood behind him, jaw locked, hat low. The realization hit her like a punch. He was part of the inspection detail. Sergeant, the officer said, eyes narrowing, your name appears twice on transfer records. Care to explain? Tex didn't move. His throat bobbed once. Administrative error, sir. Maybe, or maybe you just like traveling with this group. A murmur rippled through the carriage. Emiko looked away, wishing she could vanish into the wood. Historical archives show that American investigation units processed over 1,800 complaints of guard misconduct by 1946. Few ever saw trial, but each inspection carried the tension of exposure. The officers studied Tex like a man appraising a crack in armor. You know the rules, Sergeant. No contact beyond duty, no attachments, no exceptions. Tex finally met his gaze. Understood. His voice was steady, but his knuckles were white around the clipboard. When the officer moved on, Tex lingered near the doorway, pretending to check manifests. The lantern's glow softened the hard lines of his face. For a brief second, Emiko saw something human, regret, maybe, or guilt that had learned to walk upright. In her diary, she'd later write, he was law and outlaw both. Outside, the jungle began to thin. The train's pace slowed further, the sound of civilization faint on the horizon. A whistle echoed, distant and hollow, signaling the end of inspection. The officer barked, next stop. Camp Kuraha. Prepare for disembark. Tex turned slightly, just enough for his voice to reach her. It's better there, he said quietly, cleaner, safer. But Emiko had learned not to trust promises that came with kindness. As the whistle screamed again, the next stop would reveal a new camp, and a new stage in their uneasy collision. The gates of Camp Kuraha groaned open like the mouth of some rusted beast. The women stepped out of the train and into blinding light. No jungle this time. Just a wide gravel yard surrounded by wire and watchtowers. Everything smelled of disinfectant and diesel. Move, line up. The new guards shouted, their accents thicker, their discipline colder. This camp wasn't chaos. It was order wearing a mask. Emiko's bare feet crunched on the gravel as she joined the line. Around her, faces were pale, eyes hollow from the journey. For a moment, the horizon shimmered. Maybe freedom was finally close. But then she saw him, Tex, standing near the supply depot, clipboard in hand, his new post, his same shadow. Her stomach twisted. She'd thought the transfer was an escape. But Camp Kuraha had only changed the scenery, not the story. Records show that roughly 5% of repatriation camps across the Pacific employed American female nurses to oversee welfare checks. Their presence brought a strange contrast, kind eyes above uniforms, compassion hidden behind protocol. One such nurse, a red-haired woman named Private Ellen Ward, noticed Emiko's trembling hands during registration. "You're safe now," she whispered, almost too gently. The words barely touched Emiko's ears before Tex's voice cut across the yard. Move them to laundry duty. Safer, perhaps, but not free. The camp itself was bigger, cleaner, quieter, but the silence had weight. Everything was catalogued, recorded, controlled. Even the air seemed to move on schedule. At night, the women were given thin mattresses and new rations. Beans, rice, sometimes even fruit. For the first time in years, Emiko's stomach felt full, yet her mind refused to rest. The taste of comfort came mixed with unease. She saw Tex often now, not as a visitor, but as part of the camp's rhythm, checking rosters, inspecting supplies, pretending the past hadn't happened. When he looked her way, it wasn't lust anymore. It was something harder to name, remorse or maybe obsession stripped of charm. Freedom looked organized, she would later write, but felt hollow. The next morning, the assignment list went up on the bulletin board. Emiko's name appeared near the top laundry unit B. The same building techs supervised. Fate, once again, refused to loosen its grip. Steam filled the air like fog over a battlefield. The laundry building was a tin furnace, its roof dripping condensation, its walls echoing with the metallic rhythm of washing drums. Emiko stood ankle, deep in soapy water, her hands red from scrubbing uniforms that smelled of salt, sweat, and whiskey. Every day began the same whistle, buckets, heat, but now the routine had a ghost in it. Tex. He appeared in the doorway most mornings, leaning against the frame with that same half-dipped hat. His role was logistics supervisor, which meant he inspected the very room where she worked. Each time, Emiko could feel the air tighten. He didn't speak to her directly, not for weeks. Just brief glances, acknowledgments of a history they both pretended didn't exist. Records indicate that after gender, segregated labor divisions were introduced in 1946. Camp productivity rose by nearly 40%. To the officials, that was success. To the women, it was repetition, a mechanical kind of punishment. Emiko folded uniforms until her fingers went numb. Each piece carried the scent of men she'd never meet, soldiers who'd never know her story. The steam blurred everything. Faces, boundaries, even time. Then one afternoon, the silence cracked. Tex stepped closer than usual, setting down a clipboard beside her. "You still writing?" he asked quietly. Emiko froze. "Why?" he shrugged. "You always looked like you had words hiding somewhere." She didn't respond. Her pulse thudded in her throat. He picked up one of the folded shirts, inspected the seams, then said, almost to himself, "I thought you hated me." Her voice was steady. "I don't hate you. I just remember you." Tex's expression flickered. Surprise, then shame, "That's worse," he said softly. He turned to leave but stopped at the doorway. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." The words hung there, trembling in the heat. Emiko wanted to believe them, but apologies meant little when they came wrapped in uniforms and orders. That night, as she rinsed her hands in cold water, she caught her reflection in the metal basin, stronger, sharper, less afraid. The fear had turned into something else now, resolve, and in the days to come, that resolve would take form in ink, hidden in the fold of a soldier's shirt. The nights had grown cooler by the time Emiko began to write again. The ink bled slightly on the rough paper, each stroke trembling with what she couldn't say aloud. The diary was too dangerous to keep now, so she started writing on scraps, back of rosters, torn packaging, even ration wrappers. Words became her rebellion. One evening, after the shift ended, she stayed behind in the laundry. The last drum still spun, its hum covering the scratch of her pencil. She wrote by the weak glow of a lantern balanced on a crate. "You cannot trade love like sugar," she wrote. "You cannot buy it, borrow it, or disguise it as mercy. You only lose it. And yourself." Every word was a wound stitched closed. She folded the note carefully, slid it into the pocket of a freshly pressed American uniform, and stacked it with the rest. She didn't plan which soldier would find it. She just wanted her truth to escape the wire before she did. Historically, nearly 60% of correspondence leaving repatriation camps was censored, half never reached its destination. Still, prisoners wrote, because writing was the only form of freedom left. Outside, footsteps echoed. Tex's voice carried softly through the corridor, talking to another guard. Emiko's pulse quickened. She knew he'd be in to check the completed stack. When the door opened, she didn't look up. Steam curled between them like smoke on a cold morning. Tex flipped through the folded uniforms, his hands stopping for a moment on the one that held the letter. He didn't realize it then, but fate had just slipped between his fingers. Emiko kept her eyes on the floor, pretending to count shirts. "Everything fine, Sergeant?" she asked, tone steady. "Yeah," he said, the word slow, uncertain. "You should rest." The door shut behind him, and she exhaled for the first time in minutes. The silence that followed felt sacred. Somewhere inside that silence, a small piece of her had already escaped. Later that night, Tex would unfold the note, alone under a flickering bulb, and find her words staring back at him. He would read them once, twice, then sit perfectly still. And for the first time, the cowboy who never lost control wouldn't know what to do next. The next morning, the camp woke to an odd silence, the usual bark of commands, the clatter of buckets all muffled, as if the place itself was holding its breath. Tex hadn't reported for duty. His bunk sat empty, his hat missing from its hook. By noon, word spread through the guards he'd gone to the command office. Alone, voluntarily, inside, the air was sharp with tobacco and paper. Tex placed the folded letter on the officer's desk without a word. The major looked up, frowning. "What's this?" "My report." Tex said quietly, "Conduct violation, mine." The major's eyes narrowed. "You realize what this means?" "I do. Archival records mention that only 1 in 20 guards ever confessed to moral misconduct. For most, silence was safety, but Tex had run out of places to hide from himself. The major scanned the note, the handwriting neat, foreign, painfully human. He said nothing for a long while. Finally he looked up. "Why now?" Tex stared at the floor. "Because she wrote what I couldn't say." The major sighed, leaned back in his chair. "You'll be removed from rotation. Investigation will follow." Tex nodded. "Good." Outside, the camp carried on, unaware that a quiet reckoning had just taken place. The women worked, the guards smoked, the generator droned. Only Emiko sensed something different in the air, a strange calm where fear used to live. That evening, Ellen Ward, the red-haired nurse, approached her at the water barrel. "You heard," she whispered. Emiko shook her head. "The cowboy's gone," reported himself. For a moment, Emiko didn't move. The bucket in her hands trembled. Relief didn't come. Only an ache she hadn't expected, a sadness for what had been lost, and what could never have been right. Tex spent the night in the holding barracks. No chains, no guards. Just silence and the faint smell of paper. He read the letter again, lips moving silently through each line. When he reached the end, he whispered one word: "Forgive." He wasn't asking her. He was asking the war. Emiko didn't see him again, but the next week, her name appeared on the release list. She didn't smile. She simply folded her hands and whispered, finally. The sea stretched endlessly, a sheet of silver beneath the pale morning sun. Emiko stood on the deck of the repatriation ship, wind clawing through her hair, salt stinging her lips. Behind her, the Pacific shimmered like a wound trying to close. Ahead, Japan, home or what was left of it. The ship's horn bellowed once, long and deep, shaking the deck beneath her feet. Around her, other returnees leaned on the rails, women, children, a few old men, all staring at the horizon, as if it could answer what came next. 6.5 million Japanese souls were repatriated between 1945 and 1947, ferried home from islands, camps, and ghost towns scattered across the Pacific. Every face carried the same question: what now? Ellen Ward, the nurse, handed out small cards stamped with exit clearances. You'll land in Yokohama by sunrise, she said, smiling gently. Fresh clothes, food, transport, everything's ready. Her kindness was real, but her eyes held something else, pity. Emiko took her card and nodded. She had no luggage, only her diary and the scarf that once belonged to Hiroshi. The pages inside were filled now, no blank space left, no unspoken thoughts. Every word was survival turned into story. When the engines roared louder, she looked back one last time. Somewhere beyond that horizon, Tex's confession still sat in a file drawer, buried, forgotten, maybe destroyed. But his final act had freed her. He gave me freedom, she wrote, but not peace. Below deck, she heard laughter, children giggling over canned fruit, women humming lullabies. It sounded almost normal, almost. She leaned against the railing and let the wind carry away the smell of rust and smoke that had lived on her skin for years. The coastline appeared as a thin gray line, then mountains, then the sprawl of a broken city slowly rebuilding. Tokyo, scarred but breathing. When the first gulls circled overhead, Emiko closed her eyes. The war had taken everything that could be taken. But dignity somehow had survived. The cowboy's voice echoed faintly in her memory. Everyone trades something. She whispered back to the sea, not me, not anymore. And for the first time since captivity began, the silence around her felt like peace.